if you friend him on Facebook, and you'll see some of the excellent work that he does and stuff that he shares. And if you could give him a like and share, do the same, share some of the stuff for him. So look, everybody knows the club. You know where the toilets are, you know where the doors are, and everybody knows where the bar is. So I'll hand over to Nigel.
Thanks, folks. I hope you can hear me. My voice is very timid compared to my host here. This year, 2026, marks the 85th anniversary of the German air raids on Northern Ireland. They took place in 2 months, April and May. Whilst the greatest loss of life was in Belfast, it must be remembered that the air raids also affected other parts of Northern Ireland. In this talk, I'll be providing specific details on the different air raids, but I will be treating 2 air raids on successive days as 1 air raid. I'm afraid of getting tripped here. Part of the talk will cover statistics, which I hope will not be too boring, but it does give a flavour of the loss of life and the loss of housing in Belfast. So, start off. Does anyone recognise this scene? You shut up. Okay, anyone want to guess where it is? Sorry? No. Okay, sir, give the answer.
Old Park Road area.
Old Park Road.
Or Black Mountain in the background.
This building here is still present, and that was the parochial hall for the Catholic Church on Sacred Heart Catholic Church on the Old Park Road, and that is on Gracehill Street, and that building is still there. With all the redevelopment in the 1970s and 80s, most of the housing that was even there in the 1950s has gone, but that building is still there, and it's discernible by the 3 peaks at the top. So that's Gracehill Street running down here. This is Ballyclare Street, and this is Ballymuir Street. And you can see the amount of damage. On this side, you've got piles of bricks that have been reclaimed from the damaged houses and stacked up, ready to be reused. On the other side here, it's just rubble. The houses had been, by this stage, the houses had been demolished. Some of them had been destroyed during the air raid. Some of them were demolished because they were too dangerous to live in. On the other side of Ballymuir Street, you've got some houses which miraculously survived the air raids. And in doing this work and looking at where the damaged houses were and where the lost houses were, you could have one house that's left standing in a row. And how that happens, I just don't know. It's just, the mechanics just baffle me. Haven't been able to identify where this chimney is, but the perspective, that could be one of the chimneys over, I'd say, Brookfield Mill or something like Ewart's Mill over in the Crumlin Road in and around Cambria Street, because that's the direction it's looking. This is the same area on an Ordnance Survey map in 1960. And all this area here, which is just white, is where houses still had not been rebuilt. Some houses here had been rebuilt, and you can tell them because the shape on the map is slightly different. That's the parochial hall, which was in the other photograph. And this is just a small part of Belfast, but it shows you how much loss of housing there was. And even by 1960, 61, 20 years after the air raids, they had still not rebuilt or replaced the houses. I'm going to be looking more specifically at Ballymuir Street, Ballyclare Street in the second talk at the end of March. And in doing that, I will be picking up on the stories of some specific families, particularly ones where there was quite a few people all died at the one house. So the first air raid on Belfast took place on the night of 7th, 8th April 1941. The principal targets were the docks area and Queen's Island. This is the Alexandra Works, or what was left of the Alexandra Works at Harlenden Wolff on Queen's Road after the air raids. You can still see the gantries for the shipbuilding. The Alexandra was being used, and it's quite appropriate that we're in Alexandra, just near Alexandra Park Avenue. The Alexandra Works was being used to build fuselages for the aircrafts that were being manufactured at Short Brothers in Harland, which was adjacent to Harlenden Wolff. Bombs were also dropped in the Ballymacarrett area, and in Duncairn Ward, one high explosive bomb exploded at Brantwood Street, causing a few slight casualties, and 3 high explosion bombs exploded at Milewater Road. 13 people died during the bombing raid on 7th, 8th April, and another man who was seriously injured during the air raids died on the 20th of June, so 2.5 months later. The oldest fatality from this raid was John Esdale from Bristol Street, who was 72 years old. John was a fireman with Harlenden Wolff when he was killed at the Alexandra Works in Queen's Road. He's buried in Lecomfer Presbyterian Churchyard in County Londonderry, and he was buried there on 11th May 1941. There's no memorial at his grave. 7 of the 14 fatalities were fire watchers, and 2 were members of the Auxiliary Fire Service. The latter were Archibald MacDonald from Percy Street, who was 22 years old, and Bryce S.B. Harkness from Cookstown, who was 25. They died whilst helping to fight a major blaze at the McHugh and Dick timber yard on Duncrew Street. So obviously it was close to the railways, it was close to the shipbuilding, it was close to the other industries. And obviously with the incendiaries that were being dropped, a major blaze. According to some accounts, they saw a parachute dropping from an aircraft, and they thought it was a German airman who had bailed out. So they ran forward to capture him, only it was a parachute mine which exploded, killing them both instantly. Archibald is buried in Dundonald Cemetery, and Bryce is buried in Fort Hill Cemetery in Cookstown. So even the people that died in Belfast were not necessarily Belfast people. The largest air raid in terms of loss of life and loss of destruction to property occurred on the night of 15th, 16th April, and it's quite often known as the Easter Tuesday air raid. Is that mine? Is somebody saying have I nearly finished yet? Turn your mobiles off. Oh, you've got to laugh, haven't you? Anyway, on that air raid, the Germans also bombed Newton Ards, Bangor, and Londonderry. Or Derry, if you prefer. No. Okay. Know your audience. Okay, settle down, settle down. 710 people are recorded as dying on either 15th April or 16th April. 710 people in one night. That night, that figure is higher than the casualties, fatalities for any other air raid on the United Kingdom for one night or for one period of time. 710 people. More would die of their injuries in the days, weeks, and months to follow. William Moore from Duncairn Gardens was killed at Atlantic Avenue during this air raid. His son Trevor was injured at Atlantic Avenue during the bombing, and he died at the Royal Victoria Hospital on the 4th of September 1941. So that's 5 months later. And he was the last fatality to die as a direct result of the air raids. William and Trevor Moore are buried in Mollusk Cemetery, and 679 of the fatalities were civilians and 31 were military personnel. And I include in that people who were in the Merchant Navy. So there were Merchant Navy vessels which were moored in Belfast Harbour, and men on that were either injured and died on the ship or were injured and died in hospital. There were also several members of the British Army who died on 15th, 16th April. A lot of them were servicemen who had been posted to Northern Ireland from Great Britain, but some of them were local men who were either at home on leave or were awaiting posting onto active service. This is Messines Park in the Shantallow district of Londonderry. It was an ex-servicemen's colony built to give housing to veterans of the Great War. The bombs that dropped there destroyed a 4-house terrace, resulting in the loss of 13 lives. William Stanislaus Murray had served in the Great War with the Royal Army Medical Corps, the Royal Irish Fusiliers and the Grenadier Guards. Couldn't get rid of him. He was a clerk at the Unemployment Exchange and a sergeant in the Local Defence Volunteers. Local Defence Volunteers was formed largely out of the B Specials, and it later went on to become the Ulster Home Guard. But in 1940, 1941, it was still known as Local Defence Volunteers. He lost his life at the age of 50, along with his wife, Mary Aileen, who was 39, and 4 of their daughters, Ita, aged 13, Kathleen, aged 11, Philomena, aged 10, and Sheila, aged 10 months. So when in the German air raids, you're getting a span of deaths from the very, very young right the way up to the very, very old. They were buried in Londonderry City Cemetery on 18th April 1941. This is Hazeldean Gardens in Bangor after the air raid. Small quantity of bombs fell in Bangor, resulting in the deaths of 5 people. Matilda Lillian Grattan was 58 years old when she died at the age of 40, when she died at 40 Ashley Gardens with 2 of her adult daughters, Sheila, aged 18, and Angeline, aged 20. They're buried in Bangor Cemetery, and again, there's no memorial at their grave. Newtownards, the airfield at Newtownards was bombed, and at that time, the 70th Battalion of the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, which was a young soldiers battalion, had guard duty, were providing guard duty at the RAF station. Bombs landed on the Nissen huts, which they were using for recreational purposes, resulting in the deaths of 13 soldiers. You'll quite often hear people saying 13 young soldiers died at Newtownards Airfield. That's not correct. 13 soldiers from the 70th Battalion, a young soldiers battalion, died. But as with all the young soldier battalions, there would have been a mixture of very young guys down to the age of 16, but also there'd be a smattering of older guys who would be the NCOs, senior NCOs and officers and so forth. And they were there to help with the training. The War Office classified a young soldier as somebody who was under the age of 20. And 7 of the fatalities were under the age of 20. 2 were 16 years old. Fusilier Leslie Love was 34, and Warrant Officer Alfred Harold Penfold was 36. So you're getting guys from 16 years old and guys who were 20 years older than them being killed in the one air raid. The average age was 23, so still, on average, it was a young age for that group. And 10 are buried in Northern Ireland, 2 are buried in Great Britain, and there's no known grave for Lance Corporal Alexander Carlyle, who was 18 years old. This memorial, it's only about that height. It's a wee toty thing. It's in the Memorial Park in Newtownards, and it was put up probably about 10 or 15 years ago after a campaign by a guy called Andy Glenfield. The final 2 air raids took place on consecutive nights in May, one on the 4th, 5th, and one on the 5th, 6th. It would be practically impossible to know that if somebody was recorded as dying on the 5th of May, whether they died on the early hours of the 5th of May in the 4th, 5th air raid, or in the later hours of 5th May in the 5th, 6th. So I tend to treat this as one extended air raid. Started on the 5th, went into the 6th, so started on the 4th, went into the 5th. They had a break, went home, had a cup of tea, had a bratwurst or whatever, and then came back the following night. 12 fatalities have 4th May as the death date. 175 have 5th May as the death date, and that's because it covered the early part of the day and the later part of the day. And 20 have 6th May death dates. As with the Easter Tuesday raid, there would have been other men and women and children who died in subsequent days and weeks. 8 members of one family spanning 3 generations. In other words, parents, their children, and their children. So parents, grandparents, parents, and grandchildren died at one house at Avondale Street off Bloomfield Avenue. 5 of the fatalities were under the age of 14. So how many people did actually die in the German air raids on Northern Ireland? Frequently, there's a figure of over 1,000 quoted, and that is not correct. Some people would say we can never be 100% certain because we don't know whether there are any people who were literally blown to pieces who were never reported as being missing. If you've got an elderly gentleman or an elderly woman living on their own and they're killed in the air raid, unless anyone noticed that they weren't around anymore, their name would not necessarily be picked up. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Imperial War Graves Commission decided to compile a list of all the civilians who died during the Second World War. That was never done for the Great War because there weren't as many civilians who were killed. The Germans did bomb the coastal towns on the east coast of England, but the number of fatalities was quite low. Nothing compared to the volume or quantity of fatalities from the air raids on London, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Coventry, Glasgow, and everywhere else. Civilian war dead, 1939-45. Each council area was asked to compile details of who had died in their council area and then to submit them. The master set is held at Westminster Abbey in London, and copies of the volumes relating to Northern Ireland are held at the Northern Ireland War Memorial Museum in Talbot Street. I'm not sure if they're generally available to the public, but I think if you wanted to view them, that could be arranged. And I believe there's a copy held in the archives at Parliament Buildings. Civilian Roll of Honour was designed to record the people who died as a result of direct enemy action. In other words, people who died in the air raids, people who died when the V2 rockets came in, people who died when coastal towns were attacked by the German Navy. And that would also include civilians who died whilst in internment overseas, particularly in the Far East. A large number of civilians who were living in Malaya, Hong Kong, China, Burma, were taken prisoner by the Japanese. They were interned rather than prisoners of war, but the effect was the same. They were held in camps, they were treated disgracefully, and many of them died whilst being interned. So they would qualify to be included as a civilian war fatality. However, the returns for councils in Northern Ireland included people who were not killed as a result of direct enemy action. William Moulds, this is the entry for William Moulds, Ulster Special Constabulary. He had served in the Great War and was on duty with the Ulster Special Constabulary when he was knocked down by a car being driven by an officer from the Royal Signals on 8 September 1940. He died of his injuries. And there's also entries in the Roll of Honour for people who were killed when they found grenades or other items of ordnance. So you quite often find stories about kids that maybe found a grenade lying by the side of the road. They were chucking it around between themselves and it went off. These are the final 2 entries in the Civilian Roll of Honour for the Belfast County Borough. And this image highlights the variance in the amount of information that can be available. The entry for Robert Bennett gives his age, his home address, his wife's name, the date and location of his injuries, and where he died. So he's from Serpentine Road, died at the Mater Hospital on the same day as he was injured. The second one for William Benton records his age, his address, 224 Upper Meadow Street, and 16th April in the Antrim Road area. So they don't even know exactly where he died. Antrim Road area could cover from Carlisle Circus right the way out to Glengormley. But it could also cover any of the sides or any of the streets running off that. So with that case, he was reported as missing. His body was never recovered. And because of where he lived, an assumption was made that he died in and around that area. The Civilian Roll of Honour records 880 civilian fatalities for Northern Ireland. But it doesn't include the military fatalities or the Merchant Navy fatalities. And identifying air raid fatalities from the armed forces can be problematic, especially for individuals whose bodies were taken back to Great Britain for burial. So if you've got somebody who died on the 5th of May, you might think, well, he could be a fatality of the German air raids. But if he's buried in Yarmouth, then you're going to think, well, actually, probably isn't. But he might have been a British soldier from Yarmouth who was stationed in Belfast when he got killed. I have a list of 985 fatalities, and that includes some fatalities who are not included on the official Civilian Roll of Honour. And it also contains some fatalities who will not be included on the memorial when it's built next to St. Anne's. 895 of the people on my list are civilians, and 90 are military. Of that 90, 70 were serving with the British Army, 8 with the Royal Navy, 6 with the Merchant Navy, and 6 with the Royal Air Force. Of that figure of 985, females made up 465 of the fatalities, with one being in the Auxiliary Territorial Force. So in other words, she was in the army. She died. She was based at Victoria Barracks, and she died. She was a driver of an ambulance, and she died when the ambulance got caught up in one of the bombs. This table shows the spread of fatalities across age ranges. Now, please try to stay awake for this. I know statistics are boring, but when you look at that, 113 fatalities under the age of 10. The youngest fatality was William John Wallace of 57 Eastland Street, who was 6 weeks old when he died on 16th April 1941, along with his father. 21 fatalities were under the age of 2, and 281 were under the age of 20, and that's over 28% of all the fatalities, civilian fatalities from the German air raids for Northern, in fact, all whether they're civilian or military, were under the age of 20. That's practically a generation lost. The oldest fatality was Elizabeth McElwain of 21 Hogarth Street, who was 93 years old when she died on 16th April, and she has no known grave. And that's one of the other tragedies of the German air raids. We have the names of people who died. I know the locations where a lot of them are buried, but for several hundred, there's just no record of where they were buried. And those would be people for whom there were no remains recovered. The body wasn't recovered. Bodies that were recovered and identified, or recovered and left unidentified, were buried in the mass graves, which I'll come to later on. But there are a sizable number of people for whom nothing remained. They knew they were missing, they were reported missing, they were classified as being fatalities of the air raids, but there was nothing left to bury. And I think at that point, we'll maybe take the break for refreshments, and then we'll come back and have some more fun. Okay, folks, let's start back. As I was saying just before the break, One of the tragedies of the German air raids was the number of bodies that were never recovered, never identified. The coroner for the city of Belfast, Dr. Herbert Perry Lowe, held 5 mass inquests relating to people who had been reported as missing after the air raids. A series of public notices were placed in the major daily newspapers, in other words, the Irish News, Belfast Telegraph, Northern Whig and Belfast Newsletter, listing people who had been reported as missing. On the screen are 2 of those lists. And the gentleman over here, so what's your name?
Drew Thompson.
Drew Thompson was looking at this and he was pointing out Merview Street and Hogarth Street. And there's other names. There's another Hogarth Street there, Avoca Street, Percy Street, Annandale Street. There's 6 names, all from number 1 Annandale Street. These were all people who had been reported as missing. And they held a series of mass inquiries, and basically people were invited to come along and give evidence as to their experience in the German air raids. But those lists totaled 222 people out of the 880 who had been reported missing. So nearly 25% of the fatalities where there was bodies never recovered or never identified. Because sometimes in some of the official Civil Defence Authority casualty lists, they will have descriptions of bodies. And it might be something like, girl under 10 wearing a red dress. And that was the only description they could provide. And somebody was expected to be able to maybe identify the body from that description. The inquests were held on 12th June for 54 missing people, 19th June for 52, 26th June for 58, 23rd July for 39 people, and 29th October for 19 people. Ironically, at one of the inquests, it was discovered that 6 people named as missing, evidence was provided that they were still alive. And they were Jack Mulvena of Havana Street, Salvo Murray of 89 Gracehill Street, which is off Old Park, Charles O'Neill of 93 Gracehill Street, Bridget and Mary Rocks of 91 Gracehill Street, and Florrie Sheridan of 5 Glen Park Street. So all in the same sort of area. And what had happened was, after the air raids, people thought, well, I'm not hanging around here. And they would go to relatives living in the countryside, in the rural areas, maybe in Armagh or down in South Down or in County Antrim or wherever. And because they weren't seen around by their neighbours would say, oh, we haven't seen Nora for a while. So they put the name forward. But there were 6 people on the list as being missing who had survived. Various buildings were set aside as temporary mortuaries because basically the hospital mortuaries were overflowing. These included the public baths at Peters Hill and Falls Road. The main location for bodies was at St. George's Market. Anyone been in St. George's Market recently on a Saturday going around? Can you imagine that area filled with dead bodies? Maybe you don't want to do that if you've been in there buying a burger recently. And the remains of victims were laid out for members of the public to come in and see if they could identify their relatives, their loved ones. When a body was identified, the name, age, address, and so forth were recorded on a little cardboard piece of card, which was probably tied to the arm or whatever. And that was how the bodies were identified and recorded. Some of the bodies that were identified were taken away for private burial. In other words, the family claimed the bodies and says, we'll take care of the burial. Other bodies were identified, but they were not claimed for burial, possibly because the family couldn't afford to buy a plot, or possibly because the only person left in the family was maybe a teenager, and they couldn't afford a plot. The records for the victims identified at St George's Market for the Easter Tuesday air raid are available at Prony, but I've not been able to identify a comparable one for May. Well, some of the bodies, as I said, were reclaimed for burial. Any unidentified bodies or bodies that were identified but not claimed for private burial were then interred in plots that the CDA, Civil Defence Authority, had purchased in Belfast City Cemetery and Milltown. In terms of who went into Milltown and who went into City Cemetery, there would have to have been something identifiably marking a person as being a Roman Catholic. So in other words, if they had a crucifix or if they had a saint's medal, something like that could identify them as being Roman Catholic, then they would be buried in Milltown. But the vast majority were buried in Belfast City Cemetery. There were 2 mass funerals, one on the 21st of April and one on the 7th of May. This is the funeral, the start of the mass funeral from St George's Market. This appeared in the Northern Wig on the 22nd of April 1941, the interments having taken place on the 21st of April. The burial registers for City Cemetery indicate that the bodies of 213 air raid victims were buried in the reserved ground. 54 of the bodies were identified. They were people, and their coffins had their name on them, so that if at any stage somebody wanted to recover an identified body for private burial, they could do that, and that did in fact happen. 159 were unidentified victims. The bodies of 8 victims were subsequently exhumed, with 5 being reburied in cemeteries in England. They would have been members of the Merchant Navy or members of the British Army who had been buried there, and then they were exhumed and taken back to GB for burial. That's the memorial at the reserved ground in Belfast City Cemetery. Quite plain. The information on it is not 100% accurate. And that's the equivalent memorial at the reserve ground in Milltown Cemetery. You'll note that it says unidentified victims of enemy action, Belfast, April 1941. Well, that's not quite correct because it's unidentified and identified but unclaimed. There's actually 3 members of the Pioneer Corps who died on 5th May 1941 who were known to be buried in this plot. And it also has April 1941, but it was April 41 and May 41. Based on the size of this plot, I would estimate that there's 50 Blitz fatalities buried in that plot. The overwhelming majority of people who died either at their own homes or in the streets where they lived or in a nearby street. However, there's 97 people were injured in Belfast and died at local hospitals. 31 died at the Royal Victoria Hospital, 30 at the Mater. There were 16 deaths at the Belfast Union Infirmary, in other words, the City Hospital, and 15 at the 24th London General Hospital, which was located at Campbell College. Of those 15, 14 were British Army, and 1 was a civilian from Ballymacarrat. 3 people died at the UVF hospital at Craigavon House, and 1 died at the Stranmillis Military Hospital. So Stranmillis Teacher Training College was turned into a hospital during the Second World War. 1 soldier and 1 civilian who were injured in Belfast died at Mazarine Hospital in Antrim. So because there were so many people being admitted to hospital with injuries, some people had to be taken to hospitals, for example, at Antrim. And there were probably also some people taken to the hospital at White Abbey. Looking particularly at Greater Belfast, there were 954 fatalities in the Greater Belfast area, including 2 people who were injured at Belfast and died at hospital in Antrim. 552 or 542 were in North Belfast, and that represents 56% of all the air raid fatalities in Northern Ireland, 56% came from North Belfast. And by North Belfast, I mean basically Clifton Ward, Dock Ward, Duncairn Ward. So basically from the Crumlin Road down Clifton Street, right the way out to Whitewell Road is Duncairn Ward. 56% from that one part of Belfast. There were 235 fatalities from West Belfast, and that comprises Court Ward, Falls Ward, Shankle, Smithfield and Woodvale. However, 198 of the fatalities were from 3 wards, 54 in Court Ward. So Court Ward would be Clifton Street across to Peters Hill, and then up towards Agnes Street. That would be Court Ward. 80 in Shankle Ward, which basically ran from Agnes Street right the way up to Ballysillan. But most of the fatalities would be between Agnes Street and where the chapel is, Holy Cross Chapel at Ardoyne. And in fact, most of the people who died in Shankle Ward died in and around Heather Street and the other streets that run off Cambrai Street. Only 3 of the 31 people who died in the Royal Victoria Hospital lived in the wards in West Belfast. So whilst the Royal is in West Belfast, only 3 of the people who died there actually lived in West Belfast. There were very few fatalities for Falls Ward or for other parts of West Belfast. 32 fatalities in South Belfast, which is Cromack, Ormeau, St George's Ward, which would take in Sandy Row in the village, and Windsor Ward. 16 fatalities died at the Belfast Union Infirmary, but only 4 lived in South Belfast. So the people were being taken to hospitals maybe several miles away from where they lived. So you could get people from Tigers Bay being taken to the Belfast Union Infirmary. You could get people from the Shankle being taken to the Mater. You could get people from York Street being taken over to the hospital in Templemore Avenue. There were 16 fatalities in Belfast Harbour and Belfast City Centre. And the 6 city centre fatalities all died at one house in Gloucester Street, which is off Victoria Street between Chichester Street and May Street, if you're trying to get your bearings. 4 were members of the McCrickard family, and 2 were members of the Finnegan family. Damage to housing. I've lost count of the number of times I've seen comments on Facebook or in the newspapers or on online news stations saying that 50% of Belfast housing was rendered uninhabitable. I cannot find any substantive evidence to back up that figure. One account records that 55,000 houses were damaged. However, official reports produced by the Ministry of Public Security don't support those figures. This here is Thorndyke Street over in East Belfast. This is from a Ministry of Public Security file, and it was produced at the end of June 1941, so still relatively close after, so there could still be some anomalies in there. It records that 1,080 houses had been demolished during the air raids. 1,500 houses were recorded as being beyond repair. In other words, they would be demolished as soon as they could get round to it. 3,500 were possibly repairable. So that's houses that have been damaged, but they thought we can repair those, get them back into occupation. And 35,000 were damaged and deemed to be repairable in the near future. That gives a total figure of 39,080 houses either destroyed, damaged but repairable, damaged but unrepairable, and just damaged and repairable. And that is 35.5%. So that's coming from an official source. I can refer to that and I can say this is what the official source says. nobody can come up with the details of how the 50% is made up. And to be able to calculate the percent, you'd need to know how many houses there were in Belfast at the time. And that just would not have been known. And when you consider that large swathes of Belfast, most of South Belfast was unaffected, and that includes right across the Ormo Road and out towards Knockbreda. The other side, Malone Road, Lisburn Road, they were unaffected. Even the village, there was only one street in the village that was really badly hit, and that was Blythe Street. 24,000 houses, by the time this report was produced, 24,000 houses had already been repaired of the 35,000. So that gives an indication as to the amount of damage to housing. And of course that meant that the people that lived in those houses had to find somewhere else to live. So you had families, the remains of families, who were moving in with other members of their family, and they would then be living in cramped conditions. That's Percy Street. For those of you who are familiar with that part of town, that's St. Luke's Church on Northumberland Street, and the Shankill would be over here somewhere. And again, you can see the damage that's done there, but you can also see that the scaffolding next to these houses here, which were already being in the state of being repaired. It would be impossible to identify the locations of all the houses damaged, but while it's difficult, it is possible to get a handle on how many houses were lost, in other words, either destroyed or which had to be demolished. Another factor that has to be taken into account is that some properties would be recorded as being shops. So you might have 39 to 40, or 39 to 41 Percy Street was a grocer's shop, but there would be people living above the shop. The family that owned the shop would live on the premises. So that would still count as being a residential property. And also when you're looking at the street directories, just because a house is recorded as vacant, it doesn't mean that it's vacant because it was damaged. It just means it could be vacant because the previous occupant had moved out. So you've got to, I would have to factor all of those in to try and get a handle. There's stretches of streets recorded as vacant ground in 1942, but they might have been recorded as vacant ground in 1941 as well. So the vacant ground was not because of the air raids, it was just land that had not yet been developed or built upon. So I'm trying to give a flavour for how difficult it can be to get a real handle on how many houses were lost. I've compared a lot of, that's closer to home. That's York Road. That's where the old York Road RUC station was before they built the massive one. That's Castleton Church. It used to have a spire, which was lost during the German air raids. It took three attempts for the workmen to get the spire off the top of the tower, and in the end they had to bring in sappers from the Royal Engineers to carry out the task. There was also housing here, and you can see that that whole frontage of York Road has been wiped out, demolished. You can see the damage to the houses. There's also some of the houses here which would have been in the side streets were also removed. And then you've got the houses which they've deemed to be repairable. But sometimes when they were demolishing an unrepairable house, it caused significant damage to what was deemed to be a repairable house, and it either fell down or had to be demolished. I've gone through the street directories to try and get a handle on this, and I've come up with a figure of 2,681 houses lost due to the German air raids. When they came to rebuild, they didn't always rebuild houses where there had been houses. So, for example, on York Road, where there were houses, a petrol station was built. between York Street and North Queen Street, round about where Gallagher's was and the York Street Flax Spinning Company. A large swathe of ground there was set aside and was turned into a children's park. Now, bearing in mind there was a housing crisis, and rather than rebuilding houses, they were building play parks and play areas, or they were turning what had been housing into building industrial premises or warehouses where there had been residential houses. There was also a play park at Unity Street and Wall Street in the Carrick Hill area. On Blythe Street off Sandy Row, dining rooms for a local school were built on the sites of 15 houses. So that's 15 families that wouldn't have a house. In Tigers Bay, an extension for Curry Junior Primary School was built on the sites of 17 demolished houses between Lilliput Street and Cosgrave Street. In other locations, a lower number of houses was built. So, for example, in Ruth Street, 17 houses were built on the sites of 23 houses. Now, the rebuilt houses would have been slightly larger, and that's how you get that lower number. But in many locations, the demolished houses appear as empty ground in the Ordnance Survey maps for the early 1960s. And some of the streets were still vacant ground right the way up to 1970. So that's 30 years after the event. This is given an idea of the loss of houses in the four quarters, if you like, of Belfast. North Belfast, 57% of the housing, which equates with the 56% of lives lost. 1,527 houses lost in North Belfast, according to my figures. Other people might have other figures. I can stand over my figures because I know how I produced them. And I would challenge anyone to say that my figures are wrong, because I'm a big-headed git. Okay? Let's just get that straight. Either something is right or it's wrong, and if it's right, it's what I say. That beer must be getting to me.
You've only had one.
I have a very low capacity, not like some of the guys here. Not that I'm saying you're alkies or anything, but I'd better leave now. Stop it, you. He was on the zero Guinness. Oh dear. West Belfast, 471 houses, but most of those were in Shankle Ward, Woodvale Ward and Court Ward. South Belfast, 52 houses lost in South Belfast. Now, whenever you consider the size of West Belfast, running from the Ravenhill Road right the way through to somewhere between the Lisburn Road and the Falls Road. Okay, a lot of those areas would be more middle class, so the houses would be larger, so the ratio of houses to area would be different. Most of the houses in South Belfast were lost in one street, Blythe Street, where 33 houses were destroyed or had to be demolished. In East Belfast, you have 631 houses lost, mainly in Ballymacarrat. So Tower Street, Westbourne Street, Lendrick Street, Tamar Street, Witham Street. There were loss of houses in all of those areas. But one of the biggest areas hit was Thorndyke Street, which is off Templemore Avenue. Another factor which hasn't really been covered in a lot of the accounts of the Blitz is the loss of churches or places of worship. Does anyone recognize either of these two? Nope. Nope. One of them is not far from here. In fact, both of them are not far from here. Oh, where? This one is McCrory Memorial on Duncairn Gardens. It had to be knocked down, and when it was rebuilt, they used the same plans. Only instead of rebuilding in stone, they rebuilt in brick. That building, the replacement building, still stands. It's now Another faith group has taken it over, so it's still being used as a church. The other one is was the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church on York Street, which was located roughly where the Ulster University campus now is. So basically on the corner of, at that time, would have been York Street and Great George's Street, but now it's York Street and Dunbar Link. Those are just two of the churches. 55 places of worship were damaged during the air raids, with services having to be suspended at 14. This includes the synagogue that was at Annesley Street and various mission halls and gospel halls. That's why I've used the term places of worship rather than churches, because some people say, well, a gospel hall isn't a church, it's a gospel hall, but it's still a place of religious worship. 2 Salvation Army halls on York Street were damaged. 18 places of worship, all churches, well, nearly all churches, were destroyed during the bombing or had to be demolished. At many of these churches, the memorials from the Great War were lost. St. Barnabas lost its memorial. Duncairn Gardens had a massive white marble memorial, which was lost. York Street Presbyterian Church, there were 2 memorials there. One inside the church for the members of the congregation who served and died, and on the outside wall was another memorial tablet for the people from the Earl Street and district. In other words, people who lived between the York Street Flax Spinning Company and Gallagher's, which is now basically the East Side Business Centre car park. If you know what you should, I'm sure you know where that is. This shows where the churches in North Belfast were. 10 of the demolished churches were located in North Belfast. Okay, so North Belfast had the highest proportion of loss of life, highest proportion of loss of housing, and highest proportion of loss of churches. You'll see there's a cluster here, and they are Spa-Mount Congregational, McCrory Memorial. So Spa-Mount Congregational was on North Queen Street, at the corner of Spa-Mount Street. You then have St. Barnabas Church of Ireland, which was near Adam Street. And then you have Duncairn Gardens Methodist Church. On the other side of what I would regard as Tigers Bay, you had Newington Presbyterian Church. And in Tigers Bay itself, you had the Merview Street Mission Hall. They were all demolished or badly damaged. St. James's Church of Ireland on the Antrim Road at the junction with Cliftonville was left as a shell, had to be demolished and was rebuilt. St. Silas Church of Ireland on the Old Park Road, similarly left as virtually a shell and had to be demolished. 6 congregations amalgamated with other congregations within the same denomination rather than rebuilding, and that was mainly due to population movements. Areas that had been maybe 50-50 Catholic and Protestant, by the 1940s, they had become more Catholic. So the Presbyterian Church said, well, rather than rebuild, we'll move to another location. So, for example, York Street Presbyterian Church amalgamated with Castleton Presbyterian Church and is now called Alexandra. Duncairn Gardens Methodist Church amalgamated with the Carlisle Memorial Congregation. York Street Non-Subscribing Presby Church amalgamated with All Souls Non-Subscribing Presbyterian Church, which is in Elmwood Avenue. 4 of the 5 destroyed churches in Tigers Bay were rebuilt on the original sites. The only one which wasn't rebuilt was Duncairn Gardens Methodist Church. Effie, what did you say it became? A garage or something?
Yeah, Street's garage.
Yeah. So for a long time, people thought, just had forgotten about Duncairn Gardens Methodist Church. They forgot it had ever been there because it wasn't rebuilt. St. Silas Church was rebuilt, but it was built at a new location on Cliftonville Road, just up from Belfast Royal Academy. The Holy Trinity Church of Ireland on Unity Street in Carrickhill was relocated to the top of the old park at the junction with Ballysillan Road. And a lot of these were to do with population changes, changes in who was living in a particular area and what denomination they were. That really brings this talk to an end. This was to be an overview of the German air raids, and I hope I've given you a flavour of what happened during those basically 4 nights of bombing on Belfast. The second talk, which will be in exactly a month's time, will be looking specifically at North Belfast. And I will look in more detail at families who died. So it'll be more looking at the intricacies, the details of the families that died, but also the loss of housing in 4 areas of North Belfast. And that's going to be Tigers Bay, which is a given. The area which is now the Cityside Business Park, New Lodge, Annandale Street and so forth, just off the Antrim Road into New Lodge. And then the top of, or the middle part of Old Park Road in and around Ballynear Street, Ballyclare Street. For each of those, I'll be picking out what I consider to be the interesting stories. They're all interesting, they all have something to tell us, but I can't, if I was to tell all the stories, you'd be here for 3 months.
Will you be covering varying gardens when you do that one?
No.
Oh.
Do you want me to?
I would like you to.
Right, I'll do Varian Gardens as well. Just for him, okay? I wouldn't do it for anyone else, so don't all be coming saying, can you do this, can you do that? Varian Gardens and Whitewell Road, Serpentine Road, is a bit of an outlier because it's at the far end of Duncairn. It's out in the wilds virtually. Barber Street is another one. So yes, I'll do a wee bit on that area as well. It just means I'll maybe do slightly less in some of the other areas. But that talk, as I said, will be here on 23rd of March, 27th of March. Same time, same place, same drink. I might even have finished it by then. So I'm now going to open the floor for if anyone has any questions, or if anyone wants to provide family information or information that relates to their family during the German air raids. Okay, hands straight in the air there.
You spoke very well, Nigel, and very knowledgeable. Thank you very much. We missed the first 20 minutes. Could you say it all over again?
Yep.
I'm only joking. A serious question.
No, just before you do go on, this talk has been recorded by this young gentleman here. He doesn't look young, but he is. So it will be available on the History of Ulster website in due course. So what I'll do is once it's up, I'll send a link to Robert Matchett and he can send it out round the members. Now your question, sir.
Serious question, this chap here might be able to help the garage on Duncairn. Was it near Kilronan Street?
Yes.
Yep.
Duncairn Gardens Methodist Church was on the corner of Kilronan Street. And when you look at the old maps from 1960s, you see this block, which is just empty. You might think initially, oh, there must have been houses there, but that's where Duncairn Gardens. Yep.
Yeah. Ilchester Street was just above the
Yep.
bridge. I used to live there.
So it was Duncairn Gardens Methodist was between Kilronan Street and Ilchester Street on the front of Duncairn Gardens.
Somebody down here?
Sorry? Oh,
Nigel.
sorry. Just,
Oh, sorry.
yes, sir.
So I just down from here is Glasgow Street.
Yep.
It runs along parallel to the railway line. So the railway line get hit. You say the QDX timber yard. There's a block of houses there. A lot of us grew up down there. There's a block of houses down there that were rebuilt.
Yep.
Is there any photographs of that area?
I was talking to Effie about this during the interval. The Belfast Telegraph produced a wee booklet called Bombs on Belfast.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of photographs of localities in the immediate aftermath of the air raids. But it also has a lot of photographs after the debris had been cleared. There's a great one of East Belfast, which shows where the Methodist Church on Newtonards Road was. And you just see this square of concrete. I can't remember seeing any from Glasgow Street. I know there's some from York Park, which is not far from there. And I had that on the screen. Sorry? Yeah, the woman playing the organ, yeah. Yeah. So it was hit and miss. It also depended on how safe it was to go into a street to take photographs. For example, Hogarth Street probably lost more lives than any other street in Belfast, and more houses. But there's no photographs of the damage at Hogarth Street, or Ruth Street, or Cosgrave Street, or any of the other areas in Tigers Bay. There's some from New Lodge, there's some from York Street, some from York Road, as you've seen. So I think it depended on how safe it was for a photographer to go in. So if they were still working on demolishing houses, the photographers were probably thinking, well, I'm not going in there, I might get hit by a brick or something. But again, also there could be a factor is that a lot of the photographs in that book are from Belfast city centre. So High Street, Bridge Street, and so forth, some from City Hall. But I haven't seen any of Glasgow Street. Any other questions? Sorry, you had a question, sir.
There was one, my mother was born in North Belfast, Holidays Road, in 1935, and she always spoke to us when she was younger about people in the area of the New Lodge, Tigers Bay, who was killed in the Blitz. But she had a memory of the bodies being taken to Falls Baths.
Yep.
And placed
In the bath, yep. Basically, the Falls Baths and Peters Hill Baths were both used as temporary mortuaries. And basically, they drained the baths, and the bodies were laid out on the floor of the bath, the bathing area, that what we now maybe call a swimming pool. And people came, but any bodies which weren't identified at those temporary mortuaries were then taken to St. George's Market, and because that was the main concentration point for identifying bodies. But yes, so the next time you go for a swim, just look down in case there's any dead bodies there. Any other questions?
Nigel,
Yes, sorry.
given Belfast was a relatively young country, when this happened 20 odd years in existence, who had responsibility for the defences of Belfast?
Oh,
At the end of it,
what defences?
who was held accountable for lack of it?
Which questions do you want me to answer first?
Both.
Okay. The answer to your first question is I don't know. The answer to your second question is I don't know. I don't think anyone was held accountable. Not in the same way as Peter Mandelson has been held accountable, if you get my drift. Or that other dodgy fella. The government of Northern Ireland, decided that they would not invest in extensive protection, basically because the UDA were charging too much for the protection. I'm going to get run out of here. Basically, the government of Northern Ireland decided that more money would be better spent in England protecting London. That's where Buckingham Palace was. That's where royalty was. That's where the imperial government was. And the feeling was it would be better to protect the south of England than to protect Northern Ireland. They also did not think the Germans' aircraft could reach Belfast. And that was based on intelligence gathered in the 1930s. Now, in the 1930s, the Germans' airfields were in Germany. By end of 1940, the German airfields were on the French coast. They were a couple of hundred miles, if not 1,000 miles, closer to the United Kingdom, to Northern Ireland. And they just didn't update that. They just didn't think the Germans could reach Belfast. And that's why there was a lack of preparation. There was artillery cover. There was artillery installations at Balmoral Golf Club and at East Twin Island in Belfast Lough. There was also aerial cover, but some bright spark in the army instructed the gunnery, the artillery, not to open fire because they might hit British aircraft. There were some German aircraft that were shot down by the RAF. Some of the Royal Navy vessels that were in Belfast at the time, they started to open fire until they were told to wise up, because naval gunnery is designed not for shooting high up into the air, but for shooting flat. So naval guns, you're trying to hit another ship, you're not going to send it a couple of 1,000 feet up into the air. You're going to want to go at a curve so that it hits the ship. That's the most efficient way for naval artillery. So basically they were told, if you fire at the aircraft, you're just wasting ammunition. That doesn't really answer your question, but I just wanted to waffle a bit. It's one of the things where there's no hard evidence. Nobody was sacked. So, for example, I think Basil Brooke was the Prime Minister at the time. He wasn't sacked. The government didn't resign saying we did a bad job, we're all handing in our resignations, because they were getting the 15% pay rise. Okay, any other questions? Sorry, gentleman here and then the gentleman at the back.
Why was North Belfast built so unevenly?
Largely because of the industry. Okay, Queen's Island was a major industrial centre, but bearing in mind that the linen mills were producing the likes of parachutes, uniforms, and other material that was needed for the war effort. And that's why North Belfast was particularly badly hit. Also because they came up Belfast Lough, and you come to North Belfast before you come to South Belfast. But that would be my interpretation, is that it was because of the heavy industry. A lot of the damage to Belfast, North Belfast, was in the inner part of North Belfast. So not far from the docks. They were targeting the docks, they were targeting Queen's Island, they were targeting the likes of Sirocco Works and so forth. But they were also targeting the London and Midland Railway Service, because it was being used to transport troops. So York Street Station was demolished, destroyed, and amazingly, the First World War Memorial Obelisk survived. Now, whether it had already been taken out or whether it had been put into a protective cover, I don't know. But it survived. It's in York Road now. You can still go and see it if you don't mind climbing over barbed wire wall. Okay, gentleman at the back.
Yeah, that was sort of my question as well. I always had the impression, until tonight, I thought most of the damage was in East Belfast, because I always thought they were mainly aiming at the shipyard, and so the civilian casualties were always just from when they slightly overshot. So I was wondering why there's such
that would be my impression. I can only go with the figures that the official fatality figures, and go with where they live. You've also got to bear in mind that people didn't necessarily die where they lived. So you could get people who were from Tigers Bay who were working in the shipyard, or from other parts of North Belfast who were working in the shipyard. So in terms of the figures, but it's also because the housing was so compressed. North Belfast is one of the older parts, or inner North Belfast was one of the older parts of Belfast. So the houses were probably built in a more compressed manner. So if you're dropping a bomb where there's housing, where they're relatively small houses very close together, you're going to damage more houses than if you drop a bomb in a street where the houses are larger and more set apart.
So just building on that slightly on what Chris brought up and what you said, can you take from that then that they did target the densely populated areas to
Yes.
impact
Yes.
on civilian casualties.
Definitely.
Rather than destroy shorts, destroy the shipyard,
Well-
let's destroy those who operate it.
Correct. That would be exactly my point. They wanted to damage the industrial infrastructure, but they also wanted to try and destroy the workers who worked in. If you can have a factory, but if you don't have people to work in the factory doesn't work. So a lot of people, if you can demoralize the people, thousands of people left Belfast to go and live in the countryside, okay, after the German air raids, because they didn't feel safe. That would have had effect on the productivity of the likes of the rope works. Something like 80% of the parachutes for the British Army were made in the Belfast rope works. Phenomenal numbers, phenomenal, and it was burnt to the ground. It was totally destroyed. That means that from then on, they didn't have the capacity to make parachutes. And it went and was made somewhere else. But if you can hit the industry and hit the industrial workforce at the same time, it's a double whammy.
I remember my mother was evacuated down past Carrickfergus in 1941.
Uh-huh.
I remember saying that she was glad, she was